I'm Marsha McDowell. I'm at Michigan State University Museum and the Matrix, the digital center for, they're the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at Michigan State University. And I'm also a professor in the art department. And I am here wearing my hat as the director of the Quilt Index. And I'm here with my colleague who can introduce herself. She's the queen.
I'm Beth Donaldson, and I'm the person that puts all the information in the Quilt Index.
This presentation is about the Quilt Index, and the way we're breaking it out is that I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Quilt Index is, just a tiny bit about its history, and then something about the content of what's in the Quilt Index, and then I'm going to turn this over to Beth. I'll be working from a PowerPoint which actually she put together and I just got my hands on last night. You can tell how closely we work with each other. So what is the Quilt Index? I'll start the PowerPoint. And the Quilt Index is an open access. That means it's free for any of the users anywhere in the world to use this digital library for preservation of quilt history, and it's actually resources for teaching and research. It's a repository of images and stories about quilts and their makers, drawn from public and private collections, now we can say from around the world. It is a partnership project of Michigan State's University's Center, Digital Humanities Center. And it's an online database and management system for thematic collections that are housed in repositories of diverse size, focus, and mission. And that means the back end of this Quilt Index, all of the computer programming stuff and the database management system is actually adaptable for other projects as well. And how did this come to be? Well, first of all, we're very fortunate that we've had extraordinary funders who helped in the development and planning and the launch of this resource. 1997 is actually when we got going with our first grant, and then in 2003 we launched this project and it went live. National Endowment for the Humanities has been one of our big funders. The Institute for Museum and Library Services has been another major funder. And then we've had additional support from the Robert and Artis James Foundation and the Salzer Family Foundation, and then many individuals, quilt projects, and other entities along the way. The goals were to digitally preserve, first of all, the records from the quilt documentation projects that started to spring up in the 1980s. With the Kentucky one, there was a Michigan one that came shortly after. And what we were realizing, a group of us, meaning those people who were working on these quilt documentation projects around the country, realized thousands of people were spending energy filling out data forms on their quilts and sending those paper forms and images to a central location, which may be, in some cases, a museum or a library or an archives, but for some projects they were literally boxes under somebody's bed or in a garage. And we began to be very concerned that all of that tremendous grassroots effort at documenting quilt history and the stories of the quilts and the makers was going to be lost. And so, hence, the Quilt Index was an idea that maybe we could digitally preserve this information. So we wanted to make sure too that we had access to things like primary and documentary source material, patterns, for instance, or articles in newspapers, newspaper columns that were devoted to quilts. And then we wanted to make sure that we would create tools so that that data, massive amount of data that we envision being able to build, would be accessible. That when you turned on a computer and looked at a screen and you saw tens of thousands of quilts, that you'd actually be able to find something you were interested in. So here's what we've done today is we've just given some samples of some of the things that we've been looking at. So here's a couple of slides about the documentation projects that began in the 1980s. And there have been a ton of these projects. And I don't know, Beth, you have a number there of projects, documentation projects that were done on state levels. In some kind of situations, states divided up a state and did things by different counties. Some people did it regionally. Some states did 2 different quilt documentation projects.
And not everyone has told us what they've done. So any counts we make are not accurate, but there's over 70 recognized documentation projects. Not all of them are in the Quilt Index yet.
And so many of the projects were using similar but not identical documentation forms. So as a university problem, we had to figure out how we can make a database that would embrace all of these different forms that were being developed and used in all of these different projects. After about 3 years of planning, we were able to launch the documentation or the index in 2003. And at that time, we only had 1,800 test pilot documentation forms in there. But it was a solid start, and we tested that, and it was working beautifully, and so we went out and got more grant funds and invited more different kinds of projects, geographically dispersed, size differences, some private, some public, so that we could test how well this would be able to accommodate any kind of future project. And look at what we've got today. As of today, we have 87,813 quilts in this Quilt Index. And that is massive. And a person humanly cannot absorb all of that information, which is why I mentioned the tools that we've continued to be developing. But I did want to tell you more about the content. And I've already mentioned the kinds of documentation projects. So as an example, they had the Michigan one. And here's just one quilt. We love this quilt, which was ultimately donated to the Michigan State University Museum. It's just but one of the quilts that came in to a community quilt discovery day where it was photographed, that form was filled out, and then sent to us, and it's part of 10,000 quilts in Michigan that have already been documented. And that doesn't include any of them that are on view here and that are being made daily. So this is just a fraction of the quilt history of Michigan. And so another realm then that we started working on developing was, all right, we're now on track to accommodate documentation projects, but museums have collections, and we wanted to get those museum collections into the Quilt Index. And again, as of today, we have 320 museum collections are represented in the Quilt Index. The museums are located in 186 cities, and this is around the world. We are constantly working with those museums to continue to add quilts as they acquire them, as well as to add whole new museums. And just as, again, a couple of examples here, the International Quilt Museum we have 1,381 of their quilts, and they're still working with us to get the rest of their quilts into the Quilt Index. And then we also wanted to look at special collections that perhaps were either sub-collections of existing museums, or they were completely divorced from any repository. And so a few examples here. In this I should have Beth mention, because she has been so very deeply involved in this. And here, they can hear, I think, from here. Oh,
so
never.
The Detroit News Project in the 1930s, there was a quilt club corner in the Detroit News. And they had members from all over the country, and they put on 6 quilt shows from 1933 to 1940, where over 50,000 people a year would attend. They were open at 10 in the morning to 10 at night. They had regulars that you could read about in the column. They had their own radio show. They had their own cartoon, Miss Lazy Daisy So-and-so. And with the help of Susan Saucer, whose grandmother, Mary Gasparic, lived in Illinois and was a member of the club, Susan went to her local library in Santa Monica, California, and collected all the microfiche images of these columns. And so those columns are all being put in a special collection in the Detroit News. They're all transcribed, which makes them all completely searchable. So if you have a relative and you want to find out if maybe he or she was a member of the Quilt Club Corner, you can search for that in the Quilt Index. They met at the WWJ Studios in downtown Detroit. They met every Friday at 2 o'clock, but most of the members were reading the columns and listening to the radio show.
Including my great-grandmother, who was a member of the Detroit Rain or Shine Quilt Club, and there are articles in the paper that even show my great-grandmother, so I love it.
Your grandmother was at the infamous Belle Isle picnic where they chased the policemen off the island because the policemen didn't like the way they displayed quilts on the Schiller Monument. But I digress.
So another element that we're developing is something called legacy projects. I'll briefly say that this is a project by which a person who owns quilts or makes quilts and or has a quilt collection and has made quilts, their legacy of work in quilting can be preserved in the Quilt Index under a legacy project category. And we did a trial with the first one, happened to be Claire Vlassen. She was a member of the Capital City Quilt Guild. She was a member of the American Quilt Study Group. She was a mother of 5. She was my neighbor. And she made, how many quilts, Beth, in her lifetime?
Over 400.
Okay. And she had her own teaching research collection. And so that, Claire gave away a lot of her quilts to children, to grandchildren who were dispersed all over the country. So when she passed away, her husband, Dr. Raymond Vlassen, and I were chatting at the mailbox and said he would love to pay tributes to Claire's life, love, and engagement in quilting. And I said, well, gosh, isn't there a way we could do it in the Quilt Index? And we hatched an idea. Beth made it help happen, and Dr. Vlassen underwrote the planning and development of this. And so now, with the help of all of Claire's family members, we were able to document all of her quilts and put them into the Quilt Index. Quilt Guild members had some oral history recordings. Those are in Claire Vlassen's legacy page, along with photographs of Claire and her collection. So in one place, we've aggregated all these pieces that now the family is thrilled with, because they can go right there and see their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, or their guild members' legacy in the Quilt Index. And so we're going to be encouraging this capacity. This will be part of our sustainability effort. It will be for a fee, but it will be a wonderful tool.
Also, so all the antique quilts have been dispersed to the International Quilt Museum, the Smithsonian museums all over the country, but they still are linked to Claire through the Legacy Project, even though she's no longer the owner.
Yeah, so you can, maybe even Beth can show you the page where you pull up on the Quilt Index, you can see all of her quilts, whether she bought them and owned them or she made them. Then we have a couple of other projects that are affiliated with book projects. Beth and I and Dr. Claire Luz wrote a book on quilts and health, and as we approached owners of quilts for photographs of their quilts to be put into the book, we asked for permission to also put it into the Quilt Index. So we did that with Quilts and Health. We did it with another book on quilts and human rights. And so those are the kinds of non-museum collections that are now in the Quilt Index. Since Beth Donaldson's name is on this, this is an example of an artist page.
And what I wanted to point out is on my artist page, all the quilts that I've made and all the quilts that I own, all the antique quilts, will appear under my name. And you can tell the difference because it says creator where I've made it, and it says owner where it's an antique that I own. And so anybody is able to have an artist page, and so it's a way of collecting all your quilts in one spot, but not quite to the extent of a legacy page.
So stories too. There, along with quilts and along with quilt makers, there are many stories. And so we're in this new iteration of the Quilt Index. You will be able to access the stories that are being told. And
it's especially good if you, like your grandma, if you knew she made quilts but you don't happen to have one of her quilts. So you can tell her story. You can say that she made a lot of quilts and you can talk about her life, but if you don't have a quilt to connect it to, this is a place where that information can go.
Both of us, I think, are feminist oriented, and one of the things that the Quilt Index does do is it writes back into history the names of women, particularly, since this has been such an overwhelming feminine art form. And we love being able to see these tributes to these amazing makers of quilts. Sometimes just a few, sometimes hundreds.
We also collected the stories of mask makers. Everybody, how many people made masks during COVID?
Wow.
So we collected a whole bunch of stories about that as well.
So some other features, content that's in the Quilt Index are essays. We've had people contracted or graduate students who've written essays on different features of quilt world, and then those are illustrated. Illustrated with images that have to already be in the Quilt Index. Exhibits, this is a sort of a growing area of the Quilt Index, and we would love to see more happen here. You know, what you see here today, these are ephemeral events. I mean, these exhibits were put together for Grand Rapids. Perhaps they'll go to maybe 2 or 3 more venues, but more than likely, that's it. So they're ephemeral. What we are looking at for the Quilt Index is a way to preserve those ephemeral events so that you can see it at a point in time what an exhibit of the West Michigan Quilt Guild's presence at this AQS event would have been in 2022. We also have galleries, which are more or less illustrated.
For instance, if you have, we just did one on Nancy Page, and she had a column in the 1930s, so I went through and I found all the Nancy Page quilts I could in the Quilt Index, and I created a page so it would be easy to find them again.
Lesson plans is another, again, at the outset I said this is a resource for teaching and research. And when I say research, it's creative research too, getting ideas for art projects, quilt projects that you want to make. But it's also for people who, like me, don't make quilts, but study quilts. Lesson plans for teachers, K through college. Then we have a whole area called ephemera. We've been working with the AQSG to digitize all of the uncoverings. And we did that under a grant and only did up to, 2018?
2016.
2016. But we've just renewed conversations with them so that we can continue to get those. And if you're members of AQSG, you also know that they do blanket statements. And we said we would like those in here as well. Patterns. We've got amazing collection of patterns at Michigan State University Museum. So those
we have almost a complete collection of the Ladies Art Company, which are 500 patterns from the 1890s. We have a lot of patterns from newspapers in the 1930s. There were series quilts by Ruby Short McKim, by Nancy Page, and we have a lot of those patterns as well. So there's over 500, actually there's over 1,000 patterns. Batting wrapper patterns, Mountain Mist, Lockport.
And then we have research papers too. So we've got a number of pieces there that would be of interest. We have correspondence, round robin correspondence. We have the Quest of Benberry collection at Michigan State University, so we can pull from that and put those pieces in.
A lot of the research papers are from the Uncoverings Journal, and so this is a way that you don't have to know specifically what uncovering volume the article was in. If you go to research papers, then you can just scan it, and there's different ways you can sort it. You can sort it by date, you can sort it by author, you can sort it by title. So if you're not familiar with a lot of the research papers, you may find one you're interested in just by browsing. So the research papers can be found in different ways, and they're also hooked up to quilts so that you can see what quilts were discussed in a research paper.
Then what you're looking at right now is images from the Janet Finley collection of historical photographs that contain quilts in it. So it's marvelous. We've got about half of her collection in, and I think she'll be working with us to get the remaining part in. And then what's coming up right now, Beth is working with the California Heritage Quilt Project, one of those historical ones in the 1980s that's just been sitting there, and we're working to get those. We don't even know how many quilts yet it will be, but it will be many. The Georgia Quilt Project, 10,000 quilts. That's another 10,000 records that will be in the index. The Lebanon County, Pennsylvania Quilt Documentation Project. Remember I said some states divided up the state, which is what happened in Pennsylvania. And then we have another National Endowment for the Humanities grant recently started this summer to work with museums across the country that have collections of African and African American quilts. And we're working with the Women of Color Quilters Network and the Great Lakes African American Quilt Network, and about 6 or 7 individual artists like Dr. Carolyn Maslumi or Sean Kimber to get their collections into the index, again, in an effort to diversify and make sure that the records of that activity has been recorded and preserved. Okay, I think we're on time. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, www.quiltindex.org.